Hey you, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to do a Let's Write. It's going to be an essay, and I want to get into what it's like to actually write. There are a lot of people who tell you how to write, there are a lot of examples of good writing and bad writing, but I thought it would be really fun to give everyone some insight into what the process is like, and hopefully create a community where we can share our experiences and help each other grow, both as humans and writers. So most of what I'm going to be doing is focused on the writing here. My plan is to do this live, do it start to finish so you can see every bit of the process. If I have to get up and run to the restroom, I'm just going to let it run because I don't want you to think that there's any sort of sneakiness happening here. I want you to have full insight into the entire process. So as a fundamental start to the process, as sort of foundation, I've had some food. I've got a full belly. I'm ready to go. I feel like I've got some energy. I'm not too sleepy. It was pretty healthy stuff. And I'm going to I've got a big glass of water here with a little bit of coffee in it to give me a little bit of caffeine. Mostly I want to stay hydrated and alert. And I'm going to check my phone one last time to make sure that there's no emergencies that require my attention right now, because for the duration of the video, I want to make sure that I am not distracted. So that's on silent. That goes over here, and you won't see me look at it again. It's so easy to get distracted as writers, and it's so easy to not have what you need, and it's so easy to find excuses. So the foundation, you're ready, you've got your energy, you've got your hydration. The most important thing to do is what we're doing, is sitting down to write. And I think it can't be overstated enough how many people I see and hear about and talk to who want to write and who wind up doing everything but, right? You browse the internet, you chat with people on forums about it, you read books about it, and you say you want to write, and you do everything, you do so much research about how to write that you never actually write. So as a living example, I want us to just dive right in today. One of the things I will preface this with, it's not a provision or anything, but this channel is open to issues of politics, and we will talk about issues of politics because they're human life. And politics, the word is born out of polis, which was, I believe, the Greek word for the people, the community, right? So it's about us. We should talk about us. And if you have issues with that, questions, comments, concerns, feedback, all of that, hit me up in the comments section below. We can always chat about it. That's my hope with this series, is to talk to people and to share and hopefully have them talk back. So let's get started in on today's project. This foundational project, this first video, I really want to take a look at language itself. I want to look at how it shapes us, how it translates, and how it can be moderated to our needs, because language ultimately is a tool, right? As writers, it's our primary tool. And that's one of the great things about writing, is that you can use that tool almost anywhere. If you have a pen, if you have paper, if you have a smartphone or electronic device, these days it's very difficult not to have the access to writing. Time obviously is a huge factor, and it's a luxury, and a lot of people don't have that. And with everybody in quarantine, self-isolation, as the world battles through the year that is 2020 and the COVID-19 outbreak and the global pandemic, I think a lot of people have more time than they did. And so this hopefully is an invitation to create along with me. Now, obviously, you can't write with me at home, but hopefully this will give you some insights, give you some options and some ideas to hopefully go out and do some writing of your own. So this essay is about language, and so I've been sort of toying with this idea for a while, and one of the fundamental things when I sit down to write a piece is I need to be excited about it, right? As writers, we have to be enthusiastic, we have to be excited, we have to have opinions that we want to share, right? There's a lot of ego involved in writing, and you have to believe that what you say matters and is important. And now more than ever, I think there are voices that need to be heard, and I think it's really important that we share those voices. And so when I think about this essay and when I think about this project, I've got some issues floating around in my head that I've already considered. I want to touch on how language changes, the fact that Shakespeare is touted because he was flexible about language. I want to talk about how language can be misunderstood in the ways that it actually is an interference to communication. Most fights are about miscommunication, ultimately, which is pretty sad. And I want us to understand, too, that, like, conflict itself is not necessarily something to shy away from. Like, language is... we can talk to each other, right? And being raised in the South, I was told, we don't talk about religion and we don't talk about politics at the dinner table or with company or in any situation where someone might get their feelings hurt. And as a result, I think we have so many people who are uncomfortable talking with each other. And that's something I want to encourage again. And it's going to be tough. There's going to be some fuzziness between us. A guy I met at a bar one time said fuzziness instead of friction. And I like that a lot because it doesn't necessarily imply abrasiveness. There's some stuff between us that we need to kind of work through. And these initial essays in this sequence will help to sort of show you where I'm coming from and what the channel's about and what we're going to be doing going forward. And that way you can really understand whether or not this is something for you. I hope it is. And if it's not, I would love it if you would tell me why so that I can understand if I'm pushing people away, why that is. So let's get started. The essay, as I said, is about language. And so when it comes to titles are something I never really get hung up on too much, right? This is something that I want to be concise. I want to really nail down what I'm trying to say quickly so that we can get onto the story. Because especially with essays about language and reality and stuff like that, a lot of times you can really push people away because it's too dry, right? And so I want to make sure that this doesn't feel like an academic research paper. No offense to the academic researchers out there. That writing is very difficult, and I get it. But I don't want this to read like that, right? And so already I have an intention in my mind about what I am looking for, which is something a little bit more friendly, a little bit more fun. I'm not necessarily sure I want to go full-blown op-ed in the newspaper. I might want a little bit more, formula and research than that, but we'll see. So let's get started. And I like to name things first just to have an idea of where we're headed in the process. It gives me kind of a goal to pay attention to. So for this project, I am going to say, let's call it language. I can type better than this, I promise. Meaning and misunderstanding. Because that, understanding would inherently be the one that I wanted to go with, like language, meaning, and understanding. But I think it's a little too dry, and so by saying language, meaning, and misunderstanding, you kind of already are tripping your reader up and saying, oh, okay, so it's not just about understanding, it's about misunderstanding too. And like it or not, people love drama, right? People love conflict, people love to read about, ooh, what's that about? And the more you can encourage your reader to get excited, whether positively or negatively, the faster you are going to get a reaction, and the more likely you are that they will continue to read what you're doing. So I'm going to start by talking about the broad concept, right? One of the things I love about essays is that you can share and also present your ideas in a sort of methodical way that you can't always when you're talking, right? So if I just talked at you about what I believed, I kind of wander, I meander, I take little twists and turns, I get off topic, and eventually I find it again, but it's not as neat, it's not as pointed, it's not as meaningful often as well-done writing can be, especially a well-done essay when you're trying to communicate your ideas, right? And so I want to start with a quote that I like, and it's not just going to be like a quote at the top, like a high school or college PowerPoint project. I want to just start off by utilizing my voice. One of the things I like to do in writing is to just kind of write like I talk a lot, especially when it is my voice, when I am sharing my perspectives, because there are plenty of opportunities as writers to use voices that aren't ours, right? And we'll explore those in future episodes. But for this initial series of essays, I'm me, and I'm talking as me, and I want to share my thoughts as me. So my first sentence, I think to myself, okay, I want to say, and I apologize, my keyboard is mechanical, so it is a little loud. If this turns out to be too big an issue in future videos, I can go back and, get a different keyboard or whatever. But for now, let's just dive in and see where we're headed. So one of the quotes, and I'm just going to read this out loud as I type it, because this is how I do it, right? I kind of think about it like I'm talking to someone. And so I'll say, one of the quotes that I love the most says something along the lines of, and I've researched this quote before and I couldn't find the exact author. And so I think it's kind of just like a cultural quote that's been kind of passed around. Says something along the lines of, language is the greatest barrier to communication. Right? And right off the bat, I'm trying to hook you, right? I've got a quote I like. It's friendly. I'm not trying to be too specific. Something along the lines of, right, like, I'm not trying to directly attribute this quote because I'm not necessarily sure who said it. And it's a way for me to sort of share with you the sort of central idea that I've been chewing on and wrestling with, as there is so much conflict in this world that either goes unaddressed or is processed in violent ways. And I think conflict inherently doesn't have to be. And that's something that we'll get to, because language is the primary tool for resolving conflict, right? You talk about it, right? That's ideally what you do. That's what happens first. So language is the greatest barrier to communication. And I want to talk about the year that this is happening, because this is 2020. There's been a lot of problems in our world. The Black Lives Matter movement here in North America is going strong and has spread globally. Again, it had to be brought up again after the murder of George Floyd. And that's another point I'm going to touch on too, is the murder of George Floyd versus the death of George Floyd versus the killing of George Floyd, right? Like the way you choose to phrase it, the way you choose to phrase everything matters. And that's why language is so important, is because it's something that you put out there into the world and you can't take back, right? And spoken word especially is that way. But writing is one of those lucky places, a sort of magical, cozy, secluded space where we can we can take our time and say exactly what we mean. So one of the quotes I love most says something along the lines of, language is the greatest barrier to communication. It's certainly proven true for me. Words can be misinterpreted and misunderstood, right? They have, and I want to make this personal because I really want this to read as my experience and my perspective. I want this to be something I'm sharing with you and with others, that I can then circulate, that I can share with friends and family. And if people have questions about language and why I love it and why I hate it, I can point them to this as a sort of fun, concise way of articulating what I mean without having to talk myself in circles for the rest of my life. So words have gotten me, like when I say I see it's certainly proven true for me, I immediately think, well, words have gotten me into trouble almost as much as they've helped me in my life, right? And so I want to say something like that. I want to say words have gotten me into trouble almost as often, if not more often, than they've helped me. Words, after all, and why is that true, right? That's where my brain is going next. So words have gotten me into trouble almost as often, if not more often, than they've helped me. Why is that? Well, words, like lives, stories, and perspectives, all of which we want to talk about in these essays and on this channel, they vary, right? And I think, so when I look at this sentence, right, I see words like lives, stories, and perspectives vary. That vary, just seeing it after that comma there, looks dangly. It just looks wrong, and I've read a lot and I love to read, and obviously good writers prolific writer is not necessarily good. Please don't think I'm calling myself good. I'm enthusiastic. I'm not sure I'm good yet. But writers need to read almost as much as they write, right? It's the two things they need to do. And I just look at that sentence and it looks clunky. It looks crowded. So to break it up, what I'm going to do is, instead of saying words like live stories and perspectives vary, because that's the sentence I want to say, I want to break it up. I'm going to use a couple of hyphens, and I'm going to hyphenate this phrase so that it's sort of like is a separate idea. And I'm doing this instead of using parentheses because I don't want this to be like a private aside to you, the reader. I want this to be a broad aside because this idea here, this sentence here, this whole introductory paragraph is meant to tantalize you, right? It's meant to draw you in and make you think about the stuff we're going to be talking about. So lives, stories, and perspectives, all of that, maybe that will come up in this essay. That's exciting. Those are all things I love. I love life. I love stories. I love perspectives. Again, why we're doing this. And so that encourages your reader to be aware that this is coming, that this is maybe happening later in the essay, and that they vary. And varied perspectives in general are more fun, right? In general, I think there are some people who don't like varied perspectives, and those people often exist in echo chambers that reinforce their own worldviews, and that is anathema to what I'm wanting to do on this channel. My goal is to create a place where we can have conversation, share ideas, and show what the writing down of those ideas is like. Because if the pen is mightier than the sword, right, like it's about time we went to war, because there's a lot that feels like it's hurting and broken in the world, and a lot of it can be fixed by people talking to each other, and by people reading, and by people writing. And for those of us that have very strong convictions and opinions, I think it's really powerful to be able to share that with the world. And I think if you have those opinions and you have that conviction, that's a gift, and you should absolutely share it with the world, because it doesn't do anybody any good if you keep it bottled up inside, right? So words vary, because ultimately that's the phrase, words vary. And I'm thinking now, you're seeing my wheels turning, there's a word, connotations, right? Like connotations and denotations abound. I can talk with my friend about games, for example. And if it's one of my high school buddies, we generally know that we're talking about video games. I'm a huge nerd. I love video games. I love tabletop games. You'll hear all about that as we go. We generally know that we're talking about video games. But if I talk with a friend's kid about games, they may think of Chutes and Ladders. Chutes, and I never use the ampersand, so it's hard for me to find it. And ladders, or hide and seek, or even Duck, Duck, Goose. Right? So in a world, and so like I'm starting to feel like, I'm wandering off a little bit. I've shared this idea, words mean different things to different people, right? I've presented how they can be understood differently to different groups. And now I want to circle it back around. I've given an example. I want to circle it back around and present this sort of broad idea that I'm going to be tackling in this essay, which is that language, and I want to delineate myself from just any like research paper type thing or an op-ed in a newspaper. So I'm going to do something a little bit non-traditional. I'm going to say C. right? So like if we go back and read that again, like I'm always doing this. I'm always cycling through in my mind and like rereading the sentences. I add a sentence and I go back and I read the thought and I think, does that thought flow? Does it make sense? Are you stepping with me on the stepping stones across this stream to get to the other side together, right? So if I can talk with my friends about games, and if it's one of my high school buddies, and see already that's unnecessary. It's too much, it's extraneous, and it's making this, if it's one of my high school buddies, people know that I have people who I talk with about this. I know I do, but if you delete that section and just say, I can talk with my friend about games, and we generally know that we're talking about video games. And we know that we're talking about video games. But if I talk with a friend's kid about games, they may think, right? Typos, they happen all the time. It's no big deal. This is a first draft, right? I'm sharing it with you so you can see what it looks like, but first drafts are magical because you don't have to share them with anybody. No one has to see your first draft. And I want to take away a lot of the stigma, too, around perfection. Like, it's a symptom of white supremacy culture that we talk about a lot in America. And in the world at large is the idea that if it's not done well, you should go back and try again, right? And I think perfection keeps a lot of people from speaking up. Because I can't write perfectly, so I'm not going to write. I can't talk perfectly, so I'm not going to engage in conversation. And the fear of rejection is more powerful than the desire to connect, than the desire to make friends, than the desire to succeed. And like, there's a quote that I love, and obviously I'm going to get the author wrong, but it's like, the quote says, the worst thing you ever wrote is still better than the best thing you never did, right? So anything you contribute is better than nothing, right? Silence is violence. If you don't speak out against hate, against injustice, against cruelty, you're tacitly endorsing it. And that's another reason I want to do this series, is I want to talk about that stuff, and I want to hear your thoughts, and I want to share my thoughts with you, and I want to use writing as a way of presenting those ideas. So we've got this idea now. I would say, but if I talk with a friend's kid about games, they may think of Chutes and Ladders or hide and seek or even Duck Duck Goose. And I'm going to say, see, language is tricky. And I think I'm going to do that as a separate little line, almost like a book. Normally in essays you don't do that, but I think I want to break up that paragraph. It's starting to look a little big to me. It's starting to feel a little bit cluttered. And I want to move us along, right? Language is tricky. One thing means different things to different people. Multiple things mean the same thing to different people. To different people. Like, it's a mess. It's a mess. Hence, why language is such a barrier to communication. And one of the most, I love using exclamation points. People exclaim in real life, like I just did now. Like, hence why language is such a barrier to communication. Like, that's an exclamation point sentence, man. Use it. I know it's frowned on in a lot of like formal circles because it's too exciting. You make it too energetic. But I get energized by this stuff, and I'm going to use it, and you don't have to, and that's fine. And that's what makes writing so cool, is that each of us has our own voice and our own contributions to make, and we get to do it our way. We get to use our voice to shape these stories, right? So, hence why language is such a barrier to communication. And perhaps, and this is where I want us to start off, and perhaps the flexibility of language is one of our biggest trip-ups, right? Like my dad has been really unhappy recently because they added irregardless to the dictionary. And for a very long time, irregardless was not a word. And if you used irregardless, you would have especially in an academic environment, you would have 3 to 5 people around you jumping in front of each other to remind you that irregardless was not a word. I can't tell you how many times people corrected me about that, because I definitely used it incorrectly a number of times, and it's changed now, right? Like, it has changed, and so I want to talk about that. I want to talk about how language changes, right? And it's not static. So I'm going to say, of course, it's not static either. Language changes. It evolves. Like life itself, language grows to encompass and explain our experience. Encompass, explain, experience. I do that a lot. And there's a writer word for it, and I'm blanking on it right now, so I'm not going to hang us up on it. But the notion that you use the same vowels or the same consonants for multiple words in a row to create flow. I do that a lot, and probably too much, as you will see as we work through this. Like life itself, language, right? Great example too. Assonants, consonants and assonants. And I think they're neat. I just like them. So I use them a lot. I use similes a lot. I use metaphors a lot. And we all have those things about language that we love, and that's part of why we want to write, is because we love language, right? Which is why it's so important to me to kind of address why language can be such a hurdle to communication, and why it's important to us as writers to be diligent about using it as effectively as we can. Encompass and explain our experience. So this is kind of leading us into the first idea that I want to talk about, right? And the first idea that I'm interested in is exploring when it became a bad thing that language changed, why we need to codify language, and ultimately what purpose that serves, because that's really the arc here. I think that right there is the arc, and so I'm going to make a note of that because I just had that idea and I don't want to lose that idea, so I'm just going to create a couple bullet points right here in the middle of my essay that say, when did language need to be codified? What purpose does that serve? And you'll see here, I capitalized the W in one. I didn't capitalize the W in another. This is for me, right? This is just brainstorming. This is the ideas. If I have an idea pop into my head while I'm writing, I want to make sure I get it down so I don't lose that idea, right? I can't trust that idea will just come back to me when I need it later on in the story. So I do this. I'll have scrapbooks and pieces of paper that I'll keep beside me while I'm writing just to jot those ideas down. But for the purpose of showing it to you today, I want to do it all on screen so you can see it live as it's happening, right? So, like life itself, language grows to encompass and explain our experience. So I want to circle back to that original idea because the first bullet point here is Shakespeare was celebrated for changing it. Is now celebrated. He may not have been at the time, which is an important distinction. Is he is now celebrated for inventing new words, but he might not have been at the time. So why can't we? And that's one of the things that kind of makes me a little indignant, honestly, when I think about language and I think about the words we use to share our realities with each other and to share our experiences and our stories with each other, right? Sometimes there are words that just can't quite get us there, right? And I was excited. I was hyped, and I was so ready to just destroy somebody. I was ready to annihilate something, right? And this is where you come up with Gen X terms like yeet, right? I would yeet that coffee table if I lost in another game of Settlers of Catan, right? That's a new word, and it's used, and it's fun, and it encompasses this experience and this feeling and this reality that we didn't have words for yet, and now we do. And I just think that's so cool. I It's so cool. I remember as a kid, and I'm going to write all this down too. I'm just going to make notes about it. Feelings you don't have words for. Like, I know the Inuit have like 1,000 words for snow. And I don't have to write words there I'm doing it for you. If it were just me and I was making these notes, I could just write Inuit 1,000 for snow because I would know what that meant. I could make that mental connection. And so at the end of the day, what's important isn't that you're doing it like I do it. And I think that's really important too. This video isn't prescriptive. I'm not telling you how to. I'm showing you how I do it, right? In the hopes that you can find what works for you, maybe pull out some things that do work for you and identify some things that don't, because the more you know about how you work and what your process is, the easier it becomes to do that work, right? You streamline the process, and that comes with experience. And so, for example, in this idea, I'm talking about feelings we don't have words for, Inuit 1,000 words for snow. The big one I want to share is an anecdote about when they added dope to the dictionary, right? Like Homer Simpson says dope, and it wasn't always in the dictionary, but now it is a very common expression to describe frustration or embarrassment when you make a mistake. And we have other, expletives that we use to communicate our frustrations, but that was a new one, and it's very specific, and it's very specific without being inflammatory, right? Because it's more about, oh, I made a mistake, I screwed up, instead of a lot of expletives and curse words, which I curse like a sailor. I like to make full use of language. I take advantage of every aspect of it. But it's a great way of expressing yourself without being too offensive, and I think that's pretty cool that we didn't have that before, and we do now, and that's mind-blowing to me that we could just be like, oh, that's a thing now. Just collectively, as humanity, we can say, that is a word. That exists. So that was added to the dictionary. I want to point that out too in this first idea of the malleability of it, right? So language grows to encompass and explain our experience. One of the most, because this is a very personal essay, right? This is about me. One of the most memorable moments I had was being told that Shakespeare was lauded as a genius in college. I learned that Shakespeare was lauded as a genius for inventing words, right? Is now touted as a genius. And so I want to say something about that. I want to speak to that. And so let's say one of the lasting impacts, because I want to talk about, we still talk about him, his plays are assigned reading, whether or not you believe in the conspiracy theories that Shakespeare wasn't actually a real person, which I think is super fun, and you should look into it if you haven't yet. But I want to communicate the impactfulness for me of that by also showing how important I thought Shakespeare's contributions to language were. Right? So one of the lasting impacts, he had lots of them, but one of the lasting impacts of Shakespeare, of the works of William Shakespeare, let's say. And this is an example where it starts to sound a little bit academic, but I want to make sure that there's no room for misunderstanding. The lasting impacts of the works of William Shakespeare was his willingness to be flexible with language. Often, he created a lot of new words, often going so far as to create new ones when he needed them. Now, I'm no Shakespeare scholar, and I like to put those caveats in here too, because again, it's a way of hedging myself in this essay, right? I'm not a Shakespeare I'm an enthusiast, but I'm by no means a professional historian, right? So often going so far as to create new ones when you need them. You see, I'm circling back and feeling the pacing again, so I make sure that I'm headed in the right direction. Often going so far as to create new ones when he needed them. Now, I'm no expert on the Bard. And I just think it's fun to like casually refer to him as that, because it's like it takes away a lot of the mystique. And I think that's one of the big things I'm trying to do here too around writing, is help people understand that it's not magic, right? I think when you talk about inspiration, when you talk about muses, when you talk about the process of creation, there are so many people who just hear that and are just like, it for them it's like this ethereal thing that exists somewhere out there in the world that they've never really tapped into, and they see other people doing it and they're confused and they don't understand. Creativity is just work. Like anything else, you do a thing until you get good at it, right? And successfully creative people are just people who have done it long enough and failed enough to not be afraid of failing anymore, right? And I think as humans we can learn a lot from that. It's just the awareness that like we are going to screw up. We aren't perfect. Circling back around to that idea I talked about earlier. But it shouldn't stop us from trying, because that's how you get better, right? You see all those inspirational quotes flying around about how you have to fail at something. Failing at something is like the first step towards being a master of something, right? Thomas Edison when asked about his failures to invent the light bulb, he said, "I didn't fail at anything. I just found 8,000 ways to not make a light bulb," right? And it's the same idea. Like you've definitely got to have some stubbornness if you want to write, if you plan to write for a long time, because it's not always a process of immediate gratification, right? So let's cycle back to it. Let's go back. I'm no expert on the Bard. So I don't know how his new words were received at the time. But I know my theater teachers in school, and this is a thought that just came to me, right? Like this is an idea I had. This is thinking slowed down enough for me to type the thoughts as they come, basically. Where it's like, I'm no expert on the Bard, so I don't know how his new words were received at the time. But I know my theater teachers said he was a genius, or touted him as one of the most accomplished players of all time, or something, right? And that was my first impression of making language work for us instead of the other way around, right? So I'll say, but I know my theater teachers thought he was pretty cool. Because of it. Indeed, a lot of people do. Many tout his linguistic contributions to English. So why can't we? And I think this comes to, in terms of like the story of my life, this comes after I was raised to sort of inherently believe that I wasn't allowed to play with language, right? That language was fixed, right? And education, school is about helping you understand what those outlines and frameworks are so that you can exist effectively, right? You need to be able to communicate with each other. You need to be able to communicate with your teachers, your friends. You need to be able to do your work, and all of that requires language. So I want to touch on that. I want to just highlight this to coming out of the strict language arts classes of my upbringing. This was a novel idea. Pretty novel idea. And again, I could just say this was a novel idea, but I want to say pretty novel because this is casual, right? Like we're sitting together, we're having a drink, I'm sharing my thoughts. This was a pretty novel idea, and that like touches on it without us needing to like go through all my classes and my teachers and all that stuff, because that's not what I want to do here. I just want to identify that, like, I'm aware of the context of what I'm talking about and what my experience was. So this was a pretty novel idea. And if he could do it, why couldn't I? Why couldn't we? And I'm gonna italicize that, because this is, I think a question is always a much more impactful thing to leave an audience with than a statement, right? Like, one of the stories I love about that is at the end of The Stand by Stephen King. It's like 1,200 page book. It's ridiculous. Classic Stephen King, obviously. But at the end of it, he says he wrestled for ages with the ending. And this was in his book on writing, right? Reading him books about writing instead of actually writing. But he talked about how he wrestled with the ending, and finally he just decided not to do any of them and kind of leave it open-ended. And I know that a lot of people love that book because it goes unresolved, right? You don't know at the end of it what the main character is going to choose to do. And I think that's really powerful, because not only does it leave people room for speculation, which is always fun as consumers of entertainment. Speculation is fabulous. We can sit there and chat with friends over a beer about what we think they meant, what we think they were going to do. Well, what do you think he did afterwards? Well, what do you think he did? Why? You know, like, and then you talk about the story and you share it. And that also subtly reminds people that like, answers don't always have to happen, right? And it reinforces this idea that we cannot know, right? And not having everything written down is okay, right? And learning to be comfortable with not knowing, which is kind of what the whole process of writing is that you're not knowing what you're doing. You have a vague outline, unless you're an outliner, right? I'm a gardener, not an architect in George R.R. Martin terms, which means I like to see where it goes. I like to grow this piece of work instead of, I could have done, like with the bullet points, I could have gone through and done that for the entire essay from the beginning, and that would have been a way of doing it, and maybe that's your way of doing it, and that's awesome. Everyone's way is different, or not, and that's cool too. Like, do what works for you, and if you don't know what works for you, try both versions. Like, keep after it. Like, don't give up, because your way exists even if you haven't found it yet, right? So, and if he could do it, why couldn't I? Why couldn't we? Except language does change, right? It does change. The most powerful, and this is where I'm going to tell the story, so I can talk about the dog story here with Homer Simpson. The most ridiculous moment of my middle school life was learning that Homer Simpson's infamous sound more like Barney there, it's okay. I apologize, Simpsons fans. Had been added. And I need another comma there. Normally the comma goes inside, and maybe I just delete them both. I want to look at it and play with it. Look at it. See if you like it or not. And at the end of the day, that's what revision, that's what editors are for. But for what we're doing here, do what looks right. Do it, and this with the commas looks right to me, because the exclamation point is a part of the word in my mind, right? That's a part of the way they chronicle that word. And so that doesn't look right. Normally the comma goes inside the second quotation mark, but this just looks a little cleaner to me, so I'm going to leave it like that for now. Have been added to the dictionary. I was flabbergasted. I really was. I was stunned. I don't need to repeat myself so much. I've done that a lot already, so I'm gonna tighten that back a little bit. And a lot of being a prolific writer too is about knowing what your habits are and being able to identify them, which goes back to knowing yourself, which is a journey, right? And I'm delighted to hopefully be on this journey with you. So I was flabbergasted. Language wasn't fixed. Like, so, and this is where the difference lies. Like, so I already identified it. Like, I knew language wasn't fixed in middle school. Then why was I so shocked in college when my professor said that Shakespeare was a genius, right? Like, and I think the idea was that I didn't know it could change at all, right? I didn't know they added new words. I didn't know they updated it, the dictionary. And so, no, as a matter of fact, it was not. The dictionaries, the various dictionaries, were updated pretty regularly. And I say updated, maybe not regularly, but from time to time. And I think Merriam-Webster has a fixed schedule, but I'm not sure all dictionaries do, so from time to time is enough, right? Like, I don't need to get so specific. This isn't an essay about the update schedules of dictionaries. This is an essay about language. So and I like the idea of making this, so you saw me just try that out to see if it looked like it needed to stay one paragraph, but it doesn't. And I think that's one of the things that for me as a reader, and again, you know, write for yourself as if you were a reader, write for your audience, whoever you want that to be. This is for me, so I want to create what I would like to read, and hopefully what you will like to read. But I tried it out. I didn't like it. It felt too big. Massive chunks of text are really intimidating for me and for a lot of readers. And so when I can break things up, I like to. But obviously we've had a lot of like small to middle-sized paragraphs, so I'm ready for a bigger one, maybe. But no, this is a decisive shift, right? It was not. Various dictionaries were updated from time to time. So you see me thinking here. I'm wondering if I need to put the story about middle school ahead of the story of college so that I can kind of parallel my own growth into understanding of language. But I'm not gonna. I'm just gonna flow with it for now, and if I need to tweak it later, we can. We'll do a little bit of like half an hour of editing at the end, right? No, it was not. The various dictionaries were updated from time to time. Just this past month, they added Merriam-Webster, added the word irregardless to the dictionary. And you see there I put it inside the second quotation mark. Technically, I think that's where it belongs grammatically. But again, like, that's what editors are for. Don't spend 2 or 3 minutes of your life agonizing over a comma. Like, give it to friends, share it with people, put it out there, and let other people help you with that. Like, move on. You've got greater things to do with your life than this one comma, right? Merriam-Webster added the word irregardless to the dictionary. This has made a lot of people very upset. I think it's hilarious. And I'm going to tie this into this one because it's also sobering. Sobering reminder of the changeability of language. It's also a reminder that language is a system. As a system, can fail us. And this is where we're going to get political. This is where we're going to dive into the real world stuff, because this is happening, right? Like, what good are we as writers if we bury our heads in the sand and pretend that the world we live in isn't the world we live in, right? There's an Oscar Wilde quote I love, which says, "It takes great courage to see the world in all its tainted glory and still to love it," right? And as writers, as people with our own stories to tell us, as people who love stories so much that we want to share them and hear them from other people, we can't be held back. We can't be afraid. We can't let fear decide what we do and don't address, right? So, it's also a reminder that language as a system can fail us. George Floyd was murdered. A white police officer, because these are facts, right? George Floyd didn't just die, right? It didn't just happen. He wasn't just lying on the ground and he spontaneously stopped breathing, right? A white police officer put his knee on the man's neck until he stopped breathing. And I'm going to say George Floyd again because we cannot use his name enough. He was a person, and he's not anymore. And we have to say it, because if we don't, who will? Silence is violence, right? So, a white police officer put his knee on George Floyd's neck until he stopped breathing. And died due to a lack of oxygen. To his brain. Some people want to say he died, or talk about the tragedy. But the death of George Floyd and the tragedy of George Floyd are important because of what they don't say. As writers, for us, it's important to know. And as a writer, for me, it's important to know. It's important to know what you say, just as much as it is to know what you don't. It's just as important. I don't like it. Sounds clunky, right? So I didn't like it. I backed up. As a writer, it's just as what you say. As a writer, what you don't say is just as important as what you do. Sometimes more so. If you don't call it murder, tacitly exonerate the criminal offense that these officers who stood around doing nothing. He was murdered. While George Floyd was murdered. Perpetuated. They perpetuated a criminal offense. They murdered him, right? It's on video. It's multiple video cameras from different angles. It happened. You can't argue it didn't happen anymore. So, if you don't call it murder, you tacitly exonerate the criminal offense that this officer and the officers who stood around doing nothing while George Floyd was murdered perpetuated. I don't like perpetuated, though. It sounds a little too passive, because this was absolutely an intentional action by all of them. So let's say you exonerate. You tacitly endorse the criminality of this officer and the officers who stood around doing nothing. He didn't spontaneously die. And while it's sad, that should not be the focus. Focus should be safety of American lives, and specifically the lives of Black Americans and persons of color. But American persons of color, persons of color Americans does not sound good either. And this is where we get into the idea of where not knowing could stop me. And so, like, I could not write this paragraph or this essay because I'm afraid of getting it wrong. But I would rather condemn this action in wrong language than stay silent and be thought to support it. So, the lives of American Blacks and persons of color. And I don't need that comment because I want to be specifically the lives of American Blacks and persons of color. Right? Which brings us to racist. My understanding of this word has changed, right? Like, this is the other big issue I want to talk about. Instead of just the murder of George Floyd, I also want to talk about the word racist, because it gets misunderstood a lot, because the definition has evolved, and it hasn't been codified necessarily yet. And a lot of people get confused or frustrated or hurt or mad because they are using a word, they're used to hearing a word in one context and not understanding that it has shifted, that it has evolved, right? So, brings us to the word racist. For the longest time, racism meant prejudice against a person of another race. It doesn't anymore. It's changed. It's evolved. Much of our language has, like Homer Simpson. We're so eager to help with. Like Homer, Shakespeare. From Shakespeare to Homer Simpson. as a white man, obviously, but, a reader might not know. So, good to be explicit. As a white man, I have had to learn this. Change and incorporate it into my lexicon. Because as a writer, not just as a writer, but as a human, I always want to strive to be as culturally and humanly competent as I can. Why should anyone read my stories if I won't listen to theirs? Listen to my stories, right? Make it consistent. Listen to my stories if I won't listen to theirs. So, now holds greater weight. It incorporates the understanding of an inherent and chronicled system of prejudice and discrimination. The understanding of an inherent chronicled system. This is in our records, right? And this is why understanding white supremacy culture, and why understanding the Black Lives Matter movement, and why understanding where we are as humans, as writers, me as an American, where we are historically in the arc of our plot, right? And it's important to remember that our country, America, the United States of America, was founded on slavery and genocide of indigenous peoples. And that was not reinforced enough for me in school. And so I came out thinking that, the civil rights movement happened, it's over, we fixed racism, we fixed slavery, right? And I was post-racial. And that's damaging because it disregards the realities that our fellow Americans have to live with on a daily basis, right? That our fellow humans have to live with on a daily basis, not just in America. It happens across the world. Blacks and people of color are discriminated against around the world. And it's because of this historic catalog of systems that have been perpetuated to keep them down and keep them as second-class citizens. And in America, we have things like, Jim Crow, and we have things like the 13th Amendment now, which said that, slavery was illegal, but you lose your freedom if you're in jail. And now, as one of the smaller, more developed countries in the world, we house 1/4 of the globe's prisoners. It's a little bit imbalanced, right? And shocker of shockers, most of those criminals are black or people of color. And it's because of the systems that are in place that contribute to this nightmarish situation for them. So when a man who looks like them, who could be their dad or their brother or their cousin, is murdered on the street in broad daylight and filmed doing it by politicians, by passersby, by people, and that reality is disregarded or hand waved away, It's terrifying. Because this could be any of them. And can be any of them. Like, nobody is safe. And that's unacceptable. As a society, as a culture, as a country, as humans, that should not be allowed to happen. And the fact that it did is unconscionable. And the fact that there are still people who insist that it didn't happen or that he deserved it? Death without trial is not any human's right. Right? Like, it's a fundamental human right to death before trial. But even our judicial system is tied up in all this, and it's slanted, and we'll get there. So for now, let's rein it back into this concept of racism, right? Because it is nuanced. And the definition has become more nuanced. Has become more nuanced. It incorporates the understanding of an inherent, chronicled system of prejudice and discrimination, both in the United States and in the broader world. That system is called white supremacy culture. And it makes a lot of sense that much of the world is built to cater to whites when the world we know now has been shaped primarily by white colonization and white conflict. Primarily by white colonization and white conflict. White colonization and the ensuing white conflict. Racism now encompasses that system of discrimination. So fundamentally, no one in power, in this case, whites, white Americans, can have racism perpetuated against them. And that feels clunky, right? Like, that, even as I'm saying it out loud, that feels not great. So, and I'll point out here too, just as a minor aside, this is like the middle of the journey where I'm starting to get tired. You know, I just had this flicker in the back of my mind, like, maybe I should take a break, stretch my legs, pause the video, go for a walk. And it's like, that, whatever that voice is for you as a writer, that little, like, you know, that devil on your shoulder that says, maybe you should not write right now. You tell that voice to shut up and you keep right on working because you have things to say and they matter, right? So, can have racism perpetuated against them. It's true that many whites in America are poor or feel powerless. I'm not arguing. I'm not suggesting, right? Because we talk about conflict. I don't want to argue. Arguments to me just feel like two people shouting at each other. That's not really a conversation. I'm trying to just present my ideas, hopefully to kickstart some conversation. So it's true that many whites in America are poor or feel powerless. I'm not suggesting they might not be. I'm not suggesting they aren't. But I am insisting, I'm not suggesting that they aren't, but I am insisting that American blacks and people of color experience worse. Fundamentally. Systemically. So, racism now has changed. Language has changed. It has shifted to encompass, and I'm looking down at this little bullet list below and I'm thinking, okay, we've got to circle back around to that. Like, why? It has shifted to encompass the world we live in. This is why, in America at least, no, blacks. This is why people living in black and brown bodies in this country and many countries across the world cannot be racist anymore. They can have prejudice, sure. They can have bias, but they can't be racist. Because they don't have the power to be. They don't have the power to enforce that discrimination against others. If you don't believe me, take a look at the American Senate. So many old white dudes. For the longest time, old white dudes have called the shots. It's time for new voices. Now understand, I absolutely recognize the irony of me, a white dude, who is very soon going to be an old white dude, talking about how old white dudes need to shut up. I get it. And that inherent paradox of work that white people need to do, like we need to speak up and shut up, that's hard for a lot of people to reconcile, right? But paradox is good too because it forces us to grow. It forces us to sort of chew on things and think, okay, maybe I'm not quite seeing the whole picture here, right? To look towards broader ideas, toward context, which is going to be the subject of our next video. So as I move towards these last ideas of when did language need to be codified and what purpose does it serve, it's time for new voices. Right, and so I'm going back to the beginning just to get a sense of where we need to go to kind of like circle back around to the initial ideas of language and its changeability and its malleability and its flexibility. So for the longest time, old white dudes have called the shot. It's time for new voices. But it's also time for us white dudes to use our voices for good. We have to speak out against these atrocities. No murder should ever be sanctioned. For me, I don't think murder is like ever the answer. I don't necessarily believe in the death penalty. I think forcing someone to live with their crime is also like just as bad, but I also don't think jail is like cutting it anymore, and I think it never did. And I don't want to say our systems are broken because it implies that they don't work, but they work exactly like they're meant to. Our jail systems are a for-profit endeavor. People are making a lot of money over what are basically black and brown bodies in chains. Sound familiar? So it's also time for us, we have to speak out and use our voices to fight the other loud white voices in the room. This white supremacy culture, and this is a big deal too, like white supremacy culture is our problem, right? Like, we're the ones who used slaves. We're the ones who built our country on their backs. We're the ones who allowed Jim Crow to happen. We're the ones who allow the internment camps today, the death camps that people call immigration centers, right? It's fundamentally inhumane. And white supremacy culture is our problem, is a white issue. And until we can admit that to ourselves and start working with each other to overcome it, it's never going to get fixed, right? This is not a black issue that we are helping with. This is a white issue that the black and brown bodies in America are and around the world are victims of. Right? They are victims of this system. They did not invent it. They didn't ask for it. They don't want it. Justifiably so. It's a nightmare. And we sit around and we live our lives and we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and we tell ourselves that everyone is equal. And we're not. We're absolutely not. So, white supremacy culture is a white issue. We have to speak out and use our voices to fight the other loud white voices in the room. White supremacy culture is a white issue. And that's important enough that I think I'm going to let something like do this be a little joke there at the end and then come down here. So I want to circle back around now. When it comes to language, we cannot allow it to rule us. If a conversation of conflict, because this is another issue I want to talk about too, is like people will argue semantics for days. So if you say like, because understand, like, white people, we're all racist. Like, we've all got bias, we've all got this built-in racism that's just a fundamental part of the culture we're raised in, right? And so when we talk about racism, we all have it, right? Like, but a lot of white people insist they are not racist. They will die from screaming at the top of their lungs to remind you that they are not racist. When, as perpetuators and beneficiaries of a system that fundamentally sets them up to succeed where others don't, I mean, that's racism. So when I talk with people about racism and they get defensive and they say, I'm not racist, you have to say, okay, understand, the words have changed, right? We're working with new definitions. And people say, well, the dictionary says, and it's like, the dictionary is not always the best tool, right? The dictionary is not the be-all, end-all. And at that point, you'll get people who cry foul and say, well, what do any rules matter? Why don't we all just make it up? And if you can't hear that people are suffering and that people are dying, people are being murdered in the street, and we need to change the way we live, if you can't hear that and feel like your way of life is threatened, then it's time to reflect on your way of life because you're probably racist, right? Like, and we all are, and that's the thing, is some of us are aware of it and some of us aren't, and it's a journey, right? Like, that journey into understanding white supremacy culture is a journey, right? And some of us are at the first stop, some of us are halfway down, some of us are, and it's a lifelong journey. Like, don't get me wrong, you don't ever reach the end. There's no goal, right? You just like keep learning more, keep reading, keep doing the work, in hopes that we can make a better world for the people who are the victims of systems they didn't ask to be a part of, right? So when it comes to language, we can't allow it to rule us. If a conversation of conflict around the word racist devolves into dictionary definition slinging, then it has failed. It's missing the point. Then it's missing the point. Arguing semantics. A sure way to accomplish, to change nothing. After all, language changes. As we've shown, language changes, right? After all, language changes. Why use the dictionary at all? It's a helpful framework for living with other humans. Sure. Like, say, the Myers-Briggs Personality Index. Or the Enneagram. These are all helpful tools to facilitate the way we coexist with each other. Our coexistence on this planet. But they are not monoliths. They are not sacred. They are frameworks. We have to fill in the rest. And now, as we come to the end, I want to talk about what purpose does the dictionary serve. It's important to remember that, like, it's a tool of white supremacy culture too, right? So maybe I put it in up here because I do want to talk about it, and then we can say, so why use it at all if it's so problematic, right? So, after all, language changes. A system of codifying communication of codifying acceptable communication can also be a tool of white supremacy culture. It was created in Europe. Was literally designed by white dudes for white dudes. Trying to fit everything we know into neat little boxes is not a way to encourage growth or radical thinking. Intellectual growth. If how we talk is up to somebody else, then it's not our language anymore. Maybe it's time we take language back. Or without the help of the love of Merriam-Webster. We have to fill in the rest, right? So I'm just going back through and reading these last couple paragraphs, making sure that this feels good to me, that it feels right. And so we've gotten to that point. We've talked about what purpose does it serve? When did language need to be codified? Shakespeare. We don't need Inuit language. Maybe we do. So we'll talk about Inuit and Yeet here at the end. The end of the day, as writers and humans, language must be a tool that serves us. It should never be the other way around. It should never be the other way around. And if the murder, George Floyd, or the concept of racism upsets you, let's talk. Of course. Use language. Of course. And I want to end on a note that's like tongue-in-cheek, like a cute little button at the end, right? I love cute little buttons at the end of everything I write. The ends of chapters are like my favorite things in the world to write. Like the ends of chapters are so fun because it's like, gotcha, this last little thing. Of course, we'll have to use language for that. Let's talk. And I think that's pretty good. So let's go back up to the top, and I want to walk through it, right? And normally this is a part of the process of editing, but I want to do it now because I want to really make it clear that this is the thing I created, and I want to make sure that where I got at the end is where I meant to get when I left off. So I meant to talk about how language changes to address these issues around language that I see coming up a lot in conversations with people around the murder of George Floyd, about the Black Lives Matter movement here. And I wanted to kind of address those and talk about those within the context of my understanding of language, and I wanted to do it in a way that I could also showcase what it looks like when I write, right? Because I think there aren't a lot of opportunities to do that. Not yet. I can't wait for more. So let me go back through and I'll read this out loud for us, and hopefully this makes sense to all of us. And if there are moments where I feel like it doesn't, I will say something. So I'm not going to read it out loud because it's not the same as reading it for yourself, right? And if you need to, if I go too fast, if you want to stop and read along with me, I would love for you to. I'm going to post this on my website so you can access it at any time and share it with people or go back over it yourself or whatever you would like to do with it. But I'm going to read this right quick and make sure this goes where I want it to go. So, and if I have comments or anything like that, I'll share them with you as we go. Tricky doesn't have an E in it. Why did it let me do that? I will click just so you can see where I'm progressing in it as I read. I'm going to say, instead of at the time, I think I'm going to say in Elizabethan times. Even more than that, because this talks about the problematic hierarchy of culture, I'll point it out that it existed then too, right? So like, in the problematic hierarchy of Elizabethan culture. But I know that my theater teachers thought it was pretty cool. English language. I may use that word too much in this essay. We'll see. I'm gonna italicize this too, because this is it's a fun essay, right? It's an attempt to engage in conversation about this and hopefully invite people to the table to discuss, because I want to use what we can use, right? Like, if I can italicize something and I feel like it will add emphasis, let's do it, right? Why couldn't we? Except language does change, right? Like, I want people to really feel that. I don't remember the police officer's name, and I need to. If George Floyd is going to be remembered, we need to also remember his murderer. So I'm looking that up. You see me have my phone right here. And this is another way that I reinforce white supremacy culture, is because I won't remember the name of the murderer, right? I remember O.J. Simpson. Do I remember the name of the white cop who killed a black man on the street in broad daylight? And then, of course, the natural next question should be, which one, right? Derek Chauvin. Chauvin? Doubt it. Chauvin, probably. Some people want to say. Some people want to say he died. Talk about the tragedy. Or talk about the tragedy. But the death of George Floyd and the tragedy of George Floyd doing nothing. George Floyd stopped breathing. He didn't spontaneously die. It's sad. I want that to be its own paragraph too. That's a point I really want to drive home. I think it's really important. I think we need to listen to each other more. I think we need to talk to each other more. And I'm going to make this an aside too, just because it just boggles me. Representation is a conversation for another time, but it's very real. I'm not just going to restrict it to white dudes. I'm going to say white people. Have to thank you, Microsoft, or Google Docs. Google Docs is magical. That's the one I use for all of my work, just because it's so easy to access from all my platforms at the same time without having to pay any money. It's fabulous. This is not a sponsored video. This isn't enough. This doesn't say enough until we can admit that the core of our existence will never be dragged into the light and expunged. Properly diagnosed, let alone begin to heal. I shifted to the medical metaphor instead, because this is a wound, right? This is a wound on the hearts and spirits and souls and bodies of so many people in this country and around the world, and we have the power to begin to try to heal it, and writing is one of the many tools that we can use to do that, and I love it. But for healing to begin, you have to disinfect the wound. You have to admit you are injured, right? You can't go to the ER and the doctor says, "What's wrong with you?" and you say, "Nothing's wrong, I'm fine." It's like your leg is falling off. No, something is wrong. you gotta admit that something's wrong and tell the doctor what's wrong so that you can get it fixed, right? when it's missing. It's not just missing the point, it's failing. It's failing. I think it is failing. Things don't get better unless we are allowed room to innovate. Heck. Even Merriam-Webster allows for changes, right? And shouldn't we? If how we talk is up to somebody else, it's not our language anymore. Maybe we should maybe it's time we take language back. I like it a lot. So I read it through. I'm happy with it. I think it makes sense. I think it flows. I think it's got a button at the end. And it adequately addresses a lot of the issues that I was hoping to touch on around language and definition and the way it changes and grows and the way we should change and grow, not just as humans, but as writers, to push those boundaries and to expect better, not just of each other, but of ourselves. Like, there's always room for more words in the dictionary, right? Let's add some more of our own. Maybe one of you will one day. And that idea excites me to no end. Thank you for sharing my journey through this story. Share some of yours with me down below. Be feeling free to, hit the thumbs up button, like, subscribe, do all that. There's going to be plenty more of this coming your way over the next few months. If you have any stories you'd like to share as well, please feel free to do that below as well. Thank you so much. Have a fabulous day. And until I see you next time, don't give up. Keep writing.